of the broader conversation. But today we're going to talk a little bit about finding cross-border success, specifically a couple of the big concepts that lead to merchants being successful as they start opening their borders and working in different parts of the world. So full disclosure, as we start off, this isn't going to be kind of a comprehensive blueprint for exactly what you need to do to move from geography to geography. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you think about it, everybody's business is so unique that it would be almost impossible for someone to stand up and say, here are the steps that you need to take to move into different geographies. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk through kind of 5 core concepts of probably 10 or 12 that you'll need to touch on in the course of expanding business that are useful to keep in mind as you're choosing new geographies and new strategies for moving to new places. Also, as part of this, just something to call out, there's an awful lot of work that's been done in this space from a lot of different organizations. So some partners of Signifyd, some other research firms that you've seen, so pretty well-known names. A lot of this is going to be a little bit kind of book reporty. So you might see a bunch of statistics on the slide, not necessarily things that Signifyd have done, but some information that we've compiled from other sources. If you're interested in seeing any more detail, feel free to grab me afterwards or tweet at me. Just get my attention afterwards. Happy to share whatever information I can from my sources. You'll also see them all footnoted here as we walk through. Now, if I were sitting in your shoes and someone was standing up in front of an audience talking about expanding cross-border commerce, my first question would probably be, who is this guy talking to me and why should I trust him? I'm obviously not a merchant, so I'm not in your shoes on a day-to-day basis. We're not even really on the platform side, so we're a solutions provider. For those of you who know Signifyd, and maybe those of you who don't, we're actually an anti-fraud organization. Slight difference between Signifyd's approach to most traditional fraud companies that we put our money behind our decisions. So we don't believe that merchants should be liable for fraud. I think it's inherently inefficient for a bunch of reasons, but this isn't meant to be a pitch. One thing that is useful to point out is Signifyd does an awful lot of business all around the world. So we have about 10,000 customers that we work with, so merchants of all shapes, sizes, verticals, and about 45% of our business today is in the broader Americas. That 36% Europe should really be EMEA, as this goes down through Middle East and Africa, and about 20% of our business in Asia Pacific. While we're not the ones that are usually calling the shots, we're almost always involved in the broader strategy for merchants looking to go cross-border. Now, as it turns out, it's a really good report from Pitney Bowes just this past year. Of the top 10 concerns that merchants have when they're looking to expand their business internationally, this past year, fraud jumped from fraud concerns, specifically if I open my business to a new region, how badly would I perform from a fraud perspective in region, jumped from the 9th on the list to the 1st on the list. And that makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about it as we go through sort of some of the key concepts, but going into a new environment, you really have to change the ways you do transaction assessment, the information that's available, who you work with, partners in the space. So we're almost always involved in those conversations with merchants that we work with, specifically because we say, don't worry about it. We'll take liability for this. We'll handle that cross-border activity. So in the way of building a little bit of credibility, we have these conversations an awful lot. We work with a lot of merchants in the space. So the first of the 5 concepts that I'm going to put out. So you'll see this broken into 5 big blocks as we move through. The first is kind of interesting in that it's not so much steps that merchants need to make, but it's steps that they may have already made without necessarily knowing that they've done anything about it yet. I was actually being in Vegas. I was going to call this subject, "Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth," which is a reference to Mike Tyson, who had a bunch of fights in Vegas. And really, he had a fairly eloquent explanation of that quote when he was asked about it afterwards. And really, it's a matter of dealing with things that you didn't think you were going to have to deal with in the first place. Obviously, Mike Tyson was a pretty good boxer. A lot of people had a bunch of plans on how they're going to deal with him, and they all worked out until they got punched in the mouth. So from an e-commerce perspective, there are an awful lot of business that takes place kind of outside of the best laid plans that we might have from a merchant perspective. I put this up. So we live in a global economy, crickets. right? Obviously, we live in a global economy. It's kind of a boring slide to put up. Probably more accurately, we live in a digitally driven, highly connected, always on instant global economy. I don't have to tell anyone in this audience that that's the truth. I don't think anyone is going to refute me on that. This is an audience made up of merchants on the Magento platform. You've chosen that platform for a reason. You understand that commerce is changing and the strategies and the tools that we need in order to be effective in the space have to change with it. Now, last year, don't write this down. This is really not a slide you guys need to take. This is literally from last year. It's a screenshot from my presentation last year. But I wanted to bring this up because last year I gave a session on digital transformation for merchants going from that brick and mortar world to the online space. These numbers are already dated, so e-commerce as a percentage of total sales and mobile. But really the important thing that I wanted to highlight here is commerce has changed a lot over the last 10 years. If you think about merchants 10, 15 years ago that were trying to sell online, they were able to put up their shingle and say, I have these goods or services, world, come find me and I'll sell this to you. Today, we can't do that, right? And so this slide last year was meant to illustrate that the commerce experience is really driven by the consumer today. So consumers will tell you, I want to do my business online rather than in store, so we get this big bump in e-commerce. And more specifically, I don't even want to grab my laptop. I don't want to be on my computer. I want to be able to do this through my phone or some other type of connected device. Merchants have had to adapt to that. We've done a pretty good job with it. Well, this exact same thing holds really true for cross-border commerce. So this is a report from Nielsen that they put out. A little bit dated at this point, but still directionally correct. 57% of respondents that were surveyed globally said they'd made a transaction cross-border within the past 6 months. Now, that's an awful lot of people shopping online, and if merchants were putting hard set rules in place that weren't allowing that type of transaction, or at least people even visiting the site and getting product information, it would be extremely restrictive. So in a lot of ways, merchants are being pulled into this space if they like it or not. So the best laid plans, if you say you're going to restrict to a particular geography, it's probably not going to happen. You're going to get pulled into a bunch of different directions. A little bit more specifically, that 57% is really kind of a conservative number when you look at the breakdown. So almost every geographic region has much higher cross-border traffic or experience than the one that's left off of this, specifically being North America. And North America being left off of this, not because of Mexico or Canada in particular, but United States really lagging behind in cross-border transactions. That means originating from the US and then shopping cross-border. It's the exact opposite if you think about transactions happening within the United States, right? So a lot of these transactions from other parts of the world end up in the US, but the US, just 29% of respondents ended up saying that they do cross-border transactions, or at least did within the last 6 months. So interesting trend there. Excuse me. I think it's pretty apparent that that cross-border commerce is something that is happening. It's probably something that everyone in this room has dealt with already, if they've had plans to do this or not. Now it's a matter of digging in and making sure that we can do this a little bit more efficiently. So specifically, if we are to put a plan in place, where are we going to target? What's the opportunity size there? And what challenge am I going to run into in particular spaces? So it's important, excuse me, it's important as we start looking into the global ecosystem that we choose the right targets. And I think in any situation, if you're starting to put a plan together, the most important thing is just to quantify where the opportunities are, right? So this slide probably very familiar to everyone in the room. This is from Internet Retailer and 451 Research. I mean, to say that e-commerce is growing quickly is a bit cliche at this point, is a bit of an understatement. So currently, e-commerce business globally, about a $2.9 trillion market. Within 4 years, expected to double to $5.8 trillion. This is probably one of the few, if not the only, multi-trillion-dollar market that is growing at a double-digit rate year over year. So very exciting place to be. It's why we're all here. It's why everyone's at Imagine. The part of this stat that I think is probably most interesting is that it's growing at roughly 6 times what brick and mortar is growing. So a little bit more fuel in the fire. If you look at where we are today, the breakdown of where this commerce is taking place is coming from Statista. The big three, not so much a surprise there. So China, definitely the number 1 spot, US 2, UK 3, with Germany and Japan rounding out the top 5. So interesting to take a snapshot of where we are with regards to the top 10 geographies if we're choosing areas to go into from a cross-border perspective. But the growth is really what's more important, right? More significant. I think, excuse me, maybe the most impressive stat on this page is that China's already well ahead in the number 1 position and still growing at 1.5 times the number 2 growth rate on the list, which is US. So projected by 2023 to be over $1 trillion market itself in China. Obviously a very attractive target, provided merchants can deal with a couple of the inherent challenges from either a geopolitical perspective, having feet on the ground, particularly mainland China, or dealing with language barriers, right? So some of those can be challenging. You do see a really strong halo effect throughout the rest of Asia Pacific. So Japan on the list, South Korea on the list. We've seen a lot of interest in South Korea in particular from, at least from the fraud perspective, we see it in the retail sector quite a bit. So very strong plays there. And then Australia with extremely strong growth rates, despite being a little bit smaller from a total market than the rest. Western Europe continues to be super strong. Not a huge surprise there. We'll talk a little bit about selection practices in a couple of slides. Interestingly enough, almost every retailer goes through kind of the same 3 phases when they roll out selection of areas to go to. We'll talk about that in just a second, but this will be useful. Not super surprising if you look at United States' position in the global e-commerce economy. It's funny, if you saw this, you would say this is a chart that's dropping down to the right. This is terrible. Things must be looking really bleak for whatever economy this is. Happens to be great. I mean, obviously, U.S. is in the number 2 spot and number 2 growth rate, but the market as a whole is growing so quickly that the percentage that they have, that we have in, excuse me, in the space is a little bit smaller year after year. It's dropped actually almost from a quarter of overall e-commerce business to about 1/6 in just 5 years. A lot of that has to do with the foothold in emerging markets that we see coming out, particularly Latin America, parts of Africa, and then certainly Asia coming on very, very strong and just contributing to the overall size of that market. So really interesting. From actually, I think I'm going to hold on this slide. I will talk about that. I will talk about that selection process. So the 3 phases, it was Forrester, I believe, and I probably should have put a slide up for this report in particular because it's really interesting, but feel free to grab me afterwards. We can talk about it. Forrester put out a report talking about the process that merchants choose in choosing geographies to expand into, and almost every organization goes through the exact same 3 steps when they're choosing their next target. So first target is almost always kind of what you would expect. So you look at the largest players in the space, and you say, yep, there's really well-established infrastructure. There is a lot of opportunity there. These are definitely going to be high on the list. The next is going to be, I don't want to say emerging markets. These are areas that have very well-defined technical infrastructure, but may have either some geopolitical concerns or challenges with regards to local customs. So that's something that we see a fair amount of. Typically, the second tier of deployment will be Latin America, parts of Eastern Europe, or some parts of Asia. And then the third tier that is always considered is kind of a watch list. It's like a wait and see list. A lot of times this would be waiting to see what happens from an infrastructure perspective or what happens from a technical deployment perspective, not quite ready for prime time, and not an area that would usually be a really attractive next step or first step for a merchant to expand into. This would be areas like maybe parts of Eastern Europe, certainly parts of Asia, parts of Africa for sure. But almost every merchant goes through that same process of looking at these 3 phases. It was a really interesting report by Forrester. So wrapping up this section, talking about the opportunity that is there for merchants. So despite a lot of kind of uncertainty in the space today, and there's certainly, if you look at even just the U.S. stock market over the past couple of days, it's been amazingly volatile. Trade concerns with Asia, political uncertainty in the U.S. What's that? I thought someone said, I'm sorry, I thought someone said something. So obviously concerns in Europe around Brexit, and even what comes up pretty regularly, you might not think about it, but climate change impacting certain parts of the world and certain economies, particularly island economies, can play a role in the opportunity available for expansion to different geographies. That said, UN put out a report. Report says that at current state, global economy is fairly strong, growth rate of about 3%, which is stronger than in previous years, bolstered by a pretty strong economy in North America right now. That's expected to last through the next couple of years, but it is like a very large asterisk in that report that because of these other concerns in the space, we may not see that type of growth for very long. Just something to keep in mind, right? So regardless, obviously there's a very large opportunity. There are a bunch of geographies that seem very attractive for expansion. And depending on the product that you're working with and your level of comfort in each of these areas, I think there are some pretty good low-hanging fruit that you can point out and pick up. Now that said, one of the things I did just mention is having the right product for a geography is also really important. So, excuse me, digging into another Nielsen report. So this is one of my favorite reports to look at when we talk about e-commerce expansion internationally. So this is a fairly granular report coming from Nielsen around high growth rate SKUs effectively, or high growth rate product categories in different parts of the world. What I think is really interesting when you start digging into this is that you see some of the more established economies moving not from the traditional kind of apparel, physical goods type products. They're actually moving into fast-moving consumer goods or consumer packaged goods in force. And so if you look at some of the more developed areas within Asia Pacific, within North America, within Western Europe, top of the list are things like grocery delivery and restaurant deliveries or medicine health type things that are going to be consumed right away. So this high degree of consumption. I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that you have established infrastructure in these areas for things like same-day delivery, next-day delivery, or buy online, pick up in store. So you end up with a strong physical infrastructure that allows certain types of commerce to take place. That's not the case everywhere. It's not the case even in most of these geographies just in the past 10 years. So a lot of this is just getting developed as we start fleshing out our e-commerce strategies. So one thing I did want to point out is that a lot of the direct-to-consumer business we see now is coming from these massive names that we're all super familiar with. The ones that always come to mind are things like Lysol or Huggies or Gerber baby food. Everyone's familiar with these brand names, but they have been sold almost 100% through channel for the past forever, right, since they came out. So you could only really find these in physical stores or through the websites of those physical stores. Most of these industry titans now are starting to go direct to consumer with extremely deep pockets and a lot of resources. It's a really exciting time to see those type of changes take place. I think we'll start seeing some very well-known brands come to market under some fairly lesser-known holding companies because they have the ability to roll out, they have the infrastructure, they have the ability to support e-commerce rollouts, and we've seen quite a bit of that just in the past 18 months. It's kind of transformational. The converse of this, so if we look at kind of more emerging markets, you see some of those industry standard products that have really driven the e-commerce business in other parts of the world over the past 10 years. So this is literally that second wave coming behind the first in some of those more established markets. So if we look at parts of Eastern Europe, Africa, Middle East, certainly parts of Western Europe and Latin America, the fashion, travel, consumer electronics brands that have driven e-commerce in a lot of the more established markets are starting to come into play. And you can imagine that follow this out another 5 years, maybe it'll be faster than that, but you'll start seeing those probably more consumable products end up being more attractive in the next iteration that comes through each one of those phases. All right, so the next section that I wanted to address is respecting the local culture. Now, this goes this is a really broad subject. We could probably spend an hour just talking about what it means to, first off, do analysis and understand when practices that are put in place are being restrictive to business. So there are ways you can use a bunch of good reports online if you see use of Google Analytics and drop-off rates on certain pages, given traffic from different countries, so you can see exactly where someone comes from, the likelihood that they're expecting to see a page in their local language, they don't see it, so they drop off. Language is just one part of that. Currency, customs, the way we do business around the world is also really important to finding a foothold in a new market. So a couple of statistics, as if this presentation wasn't statistic heavy anyway. So this is from Common Sense Advisory Group. I think this is really interesting as we move down from top to bottom here. So 75% express a desire to buy products in their local language. Again, this is one of those really obvious statements. Kind of expect crickets when you say that to an audience. Of course they have a desire to interact in their local language. What's most interesting, though, is that doesn't necessarily contribute to a high bounce rate. So 59% of the respondents in the same survey actively avoid or try not to buy from English-only websites. This starts to shed a little bit more light on really what kind of the crux of the problem with. 67% have a strong desire, and I always laugh at like survey terminology. It's like, do you agree? Do you strongly agree? Do you disagree? Strongly disagree? So the strong desire is actually an entirely different category in the survey. So a strong desire to have at least a portion of the site translated. So it's like, as long as you try to interact with someone in their local language, or you put the most mission-critical pieces in kind of a more responsive format that can address the global population, it ends up solving most of the problem. So you can still have, if you're a primary English-speaking site, you can still have a lot of your site in English, provided maybe your product information is appropriately translated, your checkout page is in an appropriate language, and you can get through that without having really high abandonment rates and not necessarily having to revamp the entire site and have every geography represented across the board. So I always thought that was pretty interesting. From a currency perspective, it's a little bit more of the same. So 92% prefer to shop in local currency. Of course, makes a lot of sense. I would like to shop my local currency too. But the abandonment really happens when consumers are forced through a channel where the only option is US dollars. So having an option to do checkout in local currency, very important, or at least cover the basics as far as global currencies around the world. So picking up things like euro, picking up something outside of US dollars if you're moving into different geographies, very, very important. And one thing that I've learned over the past couple of years, I had my wrist slapped a couple of times when I kept referring to things as alternative payments. So I'm thinking about Alipay and WeChat Pay, or other types of wallets in different parts of the world. There is no such thing as alternative payments. It's just the way payments work in different places. That would be like someone in Asia saying, oh, US dollars, that's an alternative payment, right? It's just what we do here. Looking at different geographies, so United Kingdom tends to be fairly debit heavy. This is actually kind of split between debit credit. So we see about 40% credit card use in UK, 35% debit card use, much, much lower in the US for a bunch of different reasons. If we look at China specifically, so Alipay, WeChat Pay, Union Pay make up about 60% of the market, and I would wager that that's actually a really conservative number if we move through that. I think that's probably much higher. Germany tends to be a relatively credit-averse country. Interestingly enough, our one of our VPs of marketing at Signifyd is native German. We talk about this pretty regularly with regards to payment devices that are used throughout Europe. Germany is always an interesting economy because it's so well developed, very strong technical infrastructure, very strong economic infrastructure, just extremely credit averse. It doesn't help that he lives in San Francisco and had to mortgage a house, and his family said, you must be out of your mind mortgaging a house for that much. That just puts you into a ton of debt, which they are not comfortable with. And then Russia, at least from the reports, cash on delivery is still a very strong, it still has a very strong foothold there. So if these options aren't presented in each one of the geographies we're looking into, it ends up being very challenging. Or conversely, if you're looking to expand into these areas, these are things that need to be taken into account. And moving on to the fifth element, I think this is more a conceptual idea, probably a little bit less in terms of pure statistics as to the benefit of working with local partners, but I think it's good from a strategy perspective because it allows merchants to kind of take baby steps into a market. They don't necessarily have to invest the full amount of resources in building out an entire team dedicated to a region or doing an entire revamp of a site if you can work with partners in local areas. And this could touch anything from taxes to shipping. So certainly shipping and logistics in certain regions can be very, very challenging. Taxes are challenging on their own, even domestically, never mind working with international. And then obviously coming at it from a fraud perspective, that's an area where Signifyd is very strong. We would recommend that people work with someone with local experience. So we actually, if you want to take a look at it afterwards, we put together a cross-border ebook with a couple of Magento partners. So that was put out. Click the link, go check it out. DHL's involved, Vertex was involved, Akinio's involved. So we have a couple of partners that were highlighted specifically around some features there, but some stats from it. So I mentioned that tax is really challenging locally, right? So taxes is super hard. We've got a bunch of friends over on the tax jar side as well. Even state-to-state tax can be challenging. Going cross-border, going international, that ends up being compounded pretty dramatically. And in fact, there's an impact on end-user behavior when tax isn't fully understood. So up to 19% of survey respondents said that they do see tax laws and not understanding exactly how they'll be taxed as an impediment to completing a transaction. Now, is this something that can be built in-house from a merchant? Yeah, of course it can. Most merchants in this space, especially as we move up market, have the resources or have at least some capability of building out these teams internally. But you can get a foot on the ground and you can get things moving much more quickly working with someone familiar with local tax laws in each particular geography, and communicating those impact of taxes on a particular transaction to your end users ends up solving a lot of that problem. So that nearly 20% bounce rate or abandonment rate can be solved just with a little bit more concise communication. And in fact, that's something that carries over from the shipping side. So from DHL, timeline ambiguity alone. Let's say, this is something I've actually learned in my professional career as well, but communicating negative news very clearly is oftentimes received much better than even good news ambiguously, right? So shipping is kind of the same. I placed this order. I haven't heard anything back yet. If I don't know that something's happening with it, I start to freak out. I get a little bit nervous about it, and I start making phone calls to customer service. If you told me it's going to be 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and I knew exactly where it was throughout the process, sure, I might be upset that I'm not going to get this in 4 or 5 days, but I know where it is, I know what process is going on, and I'm not making constant calls to customer service. So DHL, in one of their surveys that they ran, saw a 30% reduction in customer service activity just purely addressing the where is my order questions that came up, right? So clear communication and having a partner or having a logistics company that's working can provide good, clear, concise communication around cross-border shipments ends up being incredibly beneficial to a merchant from an operational efficiency perspective from rolling those out. And then finally, from a fraud perspective, and I'll wrap up on this, but one of the most challenging things about going cross-border from a fraud perspective, you saw that it was the number one concern that merchants have in going to new geography. One of the biggest challenges about it is that it's completely foreign. So we know how to investigate orders in a domestic environment. We know what data sources to go to. We know what patterns of behavior look like, where shipments go. I can tell you, domestic US, a lot of times people ship things to their houses. That happens quite a bit, even in urban environments. If you start looking into some smaller urban regions in, say, France or parts of Europe with older streets and older buildings, a lot of times delivery is going to be located at kind of a central pickup point. That could be potentially suspicious in different parts of the world, but it's totally normal in certain areas. Also access to data, so things like address verification or public records may or may not be available in different parts of the world. Working with a partner that can take care of that certainly does help. What we have seen, excuse me, and this came from CyberSource, we have a very strong relationship with CyberSource as well, the actual fraud rate, domestic versus cross-border, is pretty much exactly the same. It's about 0.9%. However, the orders that we decline for fear of fraud are dramatically different. So we decline about 2.9% of, and we being the generic we, but we as merchants decline about 2.9% of domestic orders for fear of fraud, and almost 7% of orders for fear of fraud on cross-border transactions, even though the actual inherent risk of those transactions is exactly the same. Right? So more often than not, this is something that's fairly common in the fraud space. Getting a check on fraud is really, it's the smaller piece of the pie. Having an efficient fraud solution really is about operational efficiency, so making sure you're not wasting a bunch of time on investigating orders manually, and then that top-line approval rate is hands down the biggest benefit of having an effective fraud solution. I mentioned we work all around the world, so at least have a bit of credibility and a bit of experience in providing fraud services there. I would strongly recommend that anyone looking to make international expansion first, keep these 5 concepts in mind. As I mentioned, there are probably 10 or 12 that you really probably want to wrap your head around. I'm happy to share any reports that I referenced in here with anyone interested, provided I can. If I have the ability to do so, I'll definitely do that. Track me down afterwards. Would love to open up for any questions if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. Yeah.
So you're doing the fraud protection. So do you have a relationship with maybe like a CyberSource is doing?
We do, yeah, in different parts of the world. So we're payment device agnostic for the most part. And we can take this offline and talk about Signifyd specifically, but different payment companies and different gateways and processors will be used in different parts of the world, and any solution I think should be able to plug into those pretty effectively. Getting information from those and doing fraud assessment can be super helpful, but at least from our perspective. And yeah, happy to follow up with you on Signifyd specifically afterwards, but in general, yeah. Yeah.
I can tell you that we started using you guys, and it was game-changing.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Who are you with?
Lafayette 140.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thank you. So I will taking Signifyd out of the equation. So I'm a payment security geek by background. So I spent a bunch of time at RSA Security. I had a startup that ended up getting picked up by one of those groups as well. I do think that fundamentally the idea of any merchant in the room being responsible for fraud doesn't make any sense. The same way I wouldn't expect every merchant in the room to be a tax expert or be a shipping expert. It's not what you went into business to do. So finding more efficient ways to solve those problems, it's something we do so commonly everywhere else in our business. But thank you for that. I appreciate it. Lunch is on me. Any other questions or just general praise for Signifyd? That's also fine. No? Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Talk to you soon.